Racker and Heimann on countertransference, similarities and differences. How countertransference became a therapeutic tool. Part 2. But a question remains, what happens in the analyst during the relationship with the patient? Racker's answer is that everything happens that can happen in one personality faced with another, page 311. But in addition, there exists in the analyst an intention to understand what is happening in the analysand. Similar to Freud, 1915-17, on transference, Racker, 1957-1953b, argued that countertransference too may be the greatest danger and at the same time an important tool for understanding p. 303. He stressed that it would be a mistake to expect to find in countertransference reactions and oracle with blind faith to expect of them the pure truth about the psychological situations of the analysand p. 354. This is so even if our unconscious is a very personal receiver and transmitter, and we must reckon with frequent distortions of objective reality p. 354. Nevertheless, according to Racker, the danger in an excessive reliance on one's own unconscious, even when a very personal countertransference is occurring, is more contained than that from repressing or denying the value of messages from one's own unconscious. This is because, with personal analysis and clinical experience, the analyst should be sufficiently aware of her own personal equation, i.e., the analyst's natural tendency to some specific errors due to her own neurosis, and of her relationship with the analysand's processes and with the entire analytical practice. Racker examined in detail 3 aspects of countertransference: concordant and complementary countertransference, direct and indirect countertransference, and countertransference thoughts and positions. The analyst's intention to understand predisposes him to identify with the patient and constitutes the basis of comprehension. The analyst identifies the parts of his own psychic apparatus, ID, ego, and superego, with the patient's respective parts. This type of identification is called concordant and lies at the basis of empathy. In other cases, the analyst identifies his own ego with the patient's internal objects, a type of identification that Racker, adopting an expression of Helene Deutsch, 1926, called complementary identification. He specified that the concordant identification is based on introjection and projection, or, in other terms, on the resonance of the exterior in the interior, on recognition of what belongs to another as one's own. This part of you is I. And on the equation of what is one's own with what belongs to another, this part of me is you. The processes inherent in the complementary identifications are the same, but they refer to the patient's objects and are produced by the fact that the patient treats the analyst as an internal, projected object, and in consequence the analyst feels treated as such, that is, he identifies himself with this object. Racker 1957-1953b, page 312. Accordingly, every positive or negative transference situation provokes a positive or negative countertransference that is based on the analyst's identification with the patient's internal objects, i.e., complementary countertransference. Furthermore, Racker maintained that countertransference is governed by unconscious laws and can be repressed or blocked but not avoided. It is essential that the analyst develops an observing ego, which enables an awareness of it and then to interpret instead of enacting. Here a simplified example of complementary countertransference. If the patient's neurosis centers round a conflict with his introject father, he will project the latter upon the analyst and treat him as his father. The analyst will feel treated as such. He will feel treated badly. And he will react internally, in a part of his personality, in accordance with the treatment he receives. If he fails to be aware of this reaction, his behavior will inevitably be affected by it, and he will renew the situations that, to a greater or lesser degree, help to establish the analysand's neurosis. 1957-1953b, page 315. Although in the 1950s the term countertransference was usually restricted to the complementary countertransference, concordant countertransference too must be considered as an integral part of the overall phenomenon of countertransference. Racker reported a common situation illustrating both the concordant and complementary identifications. The analyst identifies himself with the ID and ego of the patient and with the patient's dependence upon his superego, and he also identifies himself with this same superego, a situation in which the patient places him, and experiences in this way the domination of the superego over the patient's ego. The relation of the ego to the superego is, at bottom, a depressive and paranoid situation. The relation of the superego to the ego is, on the same plane, a manic one insofar as this term may be used to designate the dominating, controlling, and accusing attitude of the superego toward the ego. In this sense, we may say, broadly speaking, that to a depressive, paranoid transference in the analysand there corresponds, as regards the complementary identification, a manic countertransference in the analyst. This, in turn, may entail various fears and guilt feelings, to which I shall refer later. 1957-1953b, page 318. With the complementary identifications, we find the direct and indirect countertransference, which we have already dealt with above. Finally, Racker divided the countertransference experiences into thoughts and positions. The former are the thoughts which the analyst suddenly discovers himself having, without however being able to find a rational connection to the patient and the material he has brought. These are linked to very deep conflicts in the analyst's mind, and so it is not unusual for them to appear both in the material of the patient as well as in the clinician's mind. The clinician should not fall into the error of impulsively trying to push them aside. He must instead examine them with careful consideration until their confirmation or negation emerges from the patient's material. When confirmed, such thoughts could be profitably used in the formation of an interpretation, while when unconfirmed, they cannot, since they are probably linked to the analyst's neurosis. On the other hand, we have the countertransference positions, or rather, the behaviorally manifested or enacted roles, which may lead to persistent role, adoptions and or acting out by the analyst, Mills 2004, pages 472 to 473. Countertransference positions often, but not always, imply deeper conflicts and a greater disturbance in the clinician, even allowing for the feelings and fantasies of the countertransference to be egosyntonic and therefore pass unobserved. An important difference between countertransference thoughts and positions lies in the degree of the ego's involvement. The first type of countertransference is experienced as thoughts, free associations, or fantasies with a slight/moderate emotional trigger from the analyst, almost as if we are dealing with something extraneous to the ego. Differently, the second type of countertransference is experienced with great intensity and as a reality, since the ego is fully involved in it. A consequence of this is that countertransference thoughts and countertransference positions differ, both in quality and content, from the experience that they evoke in the analyst, Lafarge 2007. The occurrence of one type or the other is dependent on some factors related to the analyst, such as his neurosis, defense mechanisms, inclination to anxiety, and tendencies to enact. Racker gives us a brief example of countertransference position. An analysand repeats with the analyst his neurosis of failure, closing himself up to every interpretation or repressing it at once, reproaching the analyst for the uselessness of the analysis. The analyst interprets the patient's position toward him and its origins in its various aspects. He shows the patient his defense against the danger of becoming too dependent, of being abandoned. He interprets to the patient his projection of bad internal objects and his subsequent sadomasochistic behavior in the transference, his need of punishment, his triumph and masochistic revenge against the transferred parents, his defense against the depressive position by means of schizoid, paranoid, and manic defenses, Klein. But it may happen that all these interpretations fall into the whirl and a void of the neurosis of failure. Now, the analyst feels anxiety and is angry. With the analysand, that is to say, he is in a certain countertransference position. Racker 1957-1953b, pages 319 to 21. On the other hand, a simplified example of countertransference thought is the following. At the start of a session, an analysand wishes to pay his fees. He gives the analyst a 1,000 peso note and asks for change. The analyst happens to have his money in another room and goes out to fetch it, leaving the 1,000 pesos upon his desk. During the time between leaving and returning, the fantasy occurs to him that the analysand will take back the money and say that the analyst took it away with him. On his return, he finds the 1,000 pesos where he had left it. When the account has been settled, the analysand lies down and tells the analyst that when he was left alone, he had fantasies of keeping the money, of kissing the note goodbye, and so on. The analyst's fantasy was based upon what he already knew of the patient, who in previous sessions had expressed a strong disinclination to pay his fees. The identity of the analyst's fantasy and the patient's fantasy of keeping the money may be explained as followed to the analysand's wish to take money from him, already expressed on previous occasions. The analyst reacts by identifying himself both with this desire and with the object toward which the desire is directed, hence arises his fantasy of being robbed. Racker 1957-1953b, page 321. Ultimately, Racker insists on the relative usefulness of communicating/interpreting one's own countertransference to the analysand. After starting by saying that much depends, of course, upon what, when, how, to whom, for what purpose, and in what conditions the analyst speaks about his countertransference, page 356, he argues that, even though in most cases it isn't so. There are situations in which communication of the countertransference is of value for the subsequent course of the treatment, p. 356. 3 years later, in 1956, Racker organized and chaired the APA annual symposium, choosing as theme the psychoanalytic technique. On that occasion, Racker read his paper, Counterresistance and Interpretation 1958a-1956, in which he showed that the analyst's resistance to verbalizing and interpretation indicated a more important conflict in the analysand in that moment. In addition, he showed that counterresistance in the analyst has a double root cause. First, an objective one, associated with an identification with the analysand's resistance, and then a subjective one, resulting from the fact that the identification and the fate of it also depend on the analyst's conflicts. For months later, the first Latin American Psychoanalytic Congress took place in Buenos Aires. Racker read the work Psychoanalytic Technique and the Analyst's Unconscious Masochism. According to him, the analyst's masochism, a universal tendency which exists in everyone, represents one of the forms of unconscious, negative countertransference, the analyst putting his sadistic internal object into the patient. 1958b, 1956, page 558. This masochistic inclination provokes the analyst to repeat or invert a specific relationship with his own primary objects. In this way, as countertransference is a creation Heimann of the patient and an integral part of his inner and outer world, so also, in some measure, is transference the analyst's creation and an integral part of his inner and outer world, p. 559. An explicative example is, for instance, that of an analyst whose professional activity signifies to him an attempt to destroy the father. The Oedipal guilt feeling may express itself in a moral masochism conspiring against his work. Psychological constellations of this kind may constitute, to a variable degree, a negative therapeutic reaction of the analyst. In such a case, the analyst is partially impeded in achieving progress with his patients, or else he feels unconsciously compelled to annul whatever progress he has already achieved. For example, after having given a series of good interpretations and having thus provoked a very positive transference, the analyst thereupon becomes anxious and has to disturb things through an error at his next intervention. 1958b, 1956, page 558. The following year, Racker read the lecture, A Study of Some Early Conflicts Through Their Return in the Patient's Relation to the Interpretation, at the APA Symposium on Psychoanalysis of Children. In this paper, Racker, 1960-1957, discussed the analysis of transference through the patient's relations with the interpretation and returned to the topic of stratification. The endpoint of the evolution of Racker's ideas on countertransference was in 1958, when he presented his paper, Classical and Present Techniques in Psychoanalysis, at the Second Latin American Congress of Psychoanalysis. He explicitly steered the dynamic of identifications back to projective identification, as described by Klein, and said that the analyst's identification with the object with which the patient identifies him is the normal countertransference process, Racker 1968-1958, page 66. The theoretical framework provided by Racker for the analysis of transference, countertransference rested not only on the structural model of the mind, but also on that of internal object relations. The contribution of the analyst has been fully utilized from all theoretical standpoints associated with object relations, Kerberg 1993, opening the field to new perspectives, not only in South America, CFR. De Bernardi 2000, but also in the United States, CFR. Friedman 1996, Jacobs 1999. So, a summary of the points of Racker's argument. 1. The direct reception from unconscious to unconscious is the route to understand the patient's unconscious. 2. The term countertransference indicates the totality of the analyst's psychological response to the analysand. 3. Transference and countertransference influence each other, are always present and always reveal themselves. 4. To certain transference situations there correspond certain countertransference situations, and vice versa. 5. Countertransference is based on identification with the patient's ID, ego, i.e., concordant identification, and on his internal objects, i.e., complementary identification. 6. The specific contents, feelings, and thoughts, and the intensity of the countertransferential reactions may allow us to draw conclusions about the specific character of the patient's psychological experiences, particularly her transferential situation. 7. Direct countertransference is experienced when the object is the patient, whereas indirect countertransference is experienced when it depends on an object other than the patient, such as supervisor. 8. Countertransference experiences may be divided into thoughts and positions. 9. The original neurosis, the transference neurosis, and the countertransference neurosis are centered on the unresolved Oedipus complex. 10. A double neurosis arises in the analytic situation. The countertransference neurosis is the analyst's pathological response to the patient's transference neurosis.